Our first guest is Michael Lucci, who is our economic policy expert, and he also leads our economic recovery working group, which basically is the best and brightest minds on the economy from the state voices coming through and trying to figure out how we get through this mess that we're in today. Michael also had a baby about a week ago. So Michael, welcome to the show. And how's the baby? How are you guys doing?
She's doing really well. She's sleeping right now, and hopefully it stays that way for the next hour.
Okay, well, if she wakes up, I guess we'll all get a treat and we'll get to see her. So,
Absolutely.
All right, Michael, let's dive right in, okay? First of all, what's the difference truly in terms of economic health of states that opened up in a sensible way versus states that just stayed locked down? I mean, have we seen a whole lot of difference?
Yes, we're seeing it all over the country. So let me give you one example between New York and Florida, which took very different policy directions on a number of issues, in particular economic issues. They're about the same size in terms of population, but right now, as of today, Florida has recovered 650,000 more jobs than New York has up to this point. To give you a sense of that scale, that's like all of the jobs in the state of West Virginia or all of the jobs in the state of New Hampshire. That's how far ahead Florida is compared to New York. You see the same comparison of Michigan versus its southern neighbors of Indiana and Ohio, Arizona and California, North Carolina and Georgia. You see these similarly situated states producing very different outcomes, and it's directly tied to the policies that those governors and to some extent those legislatures enact.
Wow. Okay, so what do you and the SPN working group feel are solutions to start to get the economy going again, especially in these states where things are really bad?
Well, it's important at this point to stop having these blanket economic lockdowns, which have been very harmful. There have been a lot of economic studies that have pointed to the fact that these have been main drivers of unemployment and economic losses in the states. But then in terms of state-specific recovery policies, we're looking to make sure that the lawsuit environment, the tax code, and the regulatory or red tape environment don't stand in the way of economic success. So all states can improve on this area of having lawsuit protections for businesses that are, just opening in good faith, making sure that tax code doesn't stand in the way of entrepreneurs and new businesses and new investors, and making sure that the red tape, which is like a thicket, like handcuffs in many of these states, doesn't stop people from transitioning into a new job or doesn't stop businesses from opening in new ways.
So those are all sensible reforms that the states can enact when the legislatures come back together in 2021, it sounds like. I want to talk more about that, but first, let's dive into what I think is on everybody's mind. You heard Tracy say that sometimes too much federal help is no help at all. Let's talk about the federal bailouts. Does the SPN have a lane in this? And what does success look like in your mind?
Success looks like we don't wipe away the mistakes of decades that some of these profligate and poorly managed states have gotten themselves into. And success looks like maintaining competition between the states to manage themselves well, to have competitive economies, and to grow well. We're seeing that start to play out, but if there's a broad scale federal bailout of the states, then we're not going to see the discipline. We're not going to see the rewards to the well-managed states and the discipline and restructuring that's needed in the poorly managed states. So right now, we are seeing that difference in economic recovery between the states. But if there's a broad scale bailout, that's going to diminish a lot. SPN has been actually very effective on this front. Tracy talked about briefing Vice President Pence. We've repeatedly briefed the president's top policy advisor for domestic policy, who's actually an alum of the SPN network. And we've also, I'll tell you one story. Jennifer Butler, who's our lead on federal issues, was on a call with Larry Kudlow. And Kudlow was asking the thoughts of a whole bunch of groups. And all these groups want more money, $500 billion, $1 trillion. Jennifer presented the analysis that we produced with all the state think tanks saying what the real fiscal gap was and what states can do to solve the problem themselves. And Larry pointed out, that's the kind of detailed walkthrough that I'm looking for when we have this conversation. So just in that one call, we were able to move the conversation in a more realistic and reasonable place that's helped govern how this conversation goes going forward.
That's good. And So what would you say then, knowing that these conversations are happening, we do have the ear of powerful people within the administration, but politically things are hot and it's an odd time to be having these conversations. So what do you actually think is going to be the outcome of this? And considering what's politically possible, what does success look like to you?
What we would want to see is if there's going to be more money from the federal government to the states, that money not be greater than the actual fiscal gap that states have sustained through this recession. So there has been a decline in revenue that states have experienced. Many states are able to manage this on their own. Probably over half of states are able to manage this on their own. But if there is the necessity of more federal money, and if that's a bipartisan issue, making sure that it is below, say, the $150 to $200 billion range, which represents the real gap that states face. Whereas the conversation has been $1 trillion, $700 billion, $600 billion. That's just not realistic. That's not what states are facing. And the real purpose of that is to bail out blue states that have been mismanaged for decades.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Now let's move on to talk about the state specifically. One of my favorite things about State Policy Network is that we find ways to make things better again, no matter what the federal government does or doesn't do. And the economy is no exception. So you mentioned things like tort reform, tax reform, and getting rid of bureaucratic red tape. Help me understand a little bit more how these three kinds of reforms can actually turn the tide here. Walk us through success and a little more in this plan.
Well, on tort, Justin is going to talk in more detail about that because he really helped lead a great success in Tennessee, and Buckeye led great success in Ohio. But what tort protection means is protecting businesses that operate in good faith, they're following health guidelines, so that they don't get sued back into closure right after they've reopened. So tort protection is just common sense lawsuit protection so that businesses don't get sued back into closure. On tax reform, we could cite President Obama himself and some of his top economic advisors who said you shouldn't raise taxes in a recession. So the first and most important objective here is to resist tax increases that are on the docket in Illinois, in California. Actually, New Jersey just enacted a millionaire's tax increase, but resisting tax increases that are being considered in a number of states, but having good, sensible tax relief and tax reform so that businesses are able to invest, and businesses that have a lot of losses are able to carry through even though they had a really bad year. On red tape, this is where you really see the handcuffs on entrepreneurs, on businesses, on workers who are trying to move into new industries. And this is a real bread and butter issue where a lot of ideas that have been promulgated across SPN are now very timely. Issues related to occupational licensing, the treatment of new types of industries. There's a great opportunity to enact policies to lock in good policy that will lead to greater economic success if those states take the right path.
So Michael, SPN's model is always state solutions that lead to national impact. And we have seen time and time again that if you can get a good policy passed in one state and spread to another and another and another, eventually it makes its way across the map and becomes the new normal. So on something like this, how is that going to work? Do you have the target states? Do you know how many there are? What's the kind of broader goal you're talking about in the short term?
We have 10 target states, and we are targeting having 20 reforms total passed across those 10 states. However, there are states that are outside of our target group that we're feeding individual reforms to, and they're running with those individual reforms. So, for example, the state of Arizona is not one of our particular target states this year, but we've already fed 2 specific tax reforms into the Arizona governor's office. For our target states, it's a more intensive look at those tort, tax, and red tape issues in order to produce a recovery. And what we're shooting for is we want states to recover all the jobs that they lost during this recession and get their unemployment rates back below 5%. The more pro-growth policies they enact, the faster that will happen. And again, we're already seeing that play out. There are some states that aren't too far from recovering all the jobs that they lost. There are other states where it's going to take years because they're making, pretty much every mistake that they can. So that's our goal for those target states, is that they lead the way, they get people back to work in their states, and then either people move into their state because they have a better economy, or their competitor states have to follow some of the same pathways so that they could have job creation in their state too.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, last question. You shared a few great stories about good and bad things that are happening in the states. We're about to hear from Justin. Is there anything that pops out in your mind that you want to leave us with in terms of a story of success, something good that you've seen happen in this vein in a state?
So Justin will talk about the lawsuit reforms, and there have been successes in Tennessee, in Ohio, in Kansas, in Oklahoma, and other states. One of the areas where we're very hopeful is reforming occupational licensing. There's a number of parts to that, but I'll just tell you about one, which is allowing people to move between states and allowing their license to transfer. We saw Arizona enact that reform in 2019. In 2020, state legislatures have really been restricted. They haven't been together that much, and when they had, they've only dealt with targeted issues. But already in 2020, Missouri actually passed the same type of licensing reform to allow people to move in and out of states, maintaining their license across state borders. But we saw dozens of other states already introduce such legislation, and we're very hopeful that in 2021, during the legislative session, a lot of states will enact that good policy. That's one example of a really meaningful policy that will affect tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of workers who are moving across borders to find an opportunity.
Thanks, Michael. That's a great example of how we can remove some barriers so that people can work anywhere. And that reminds me, our colleague Kathleen O'Hearn always tells the story, and she told us on the show a few months ago, of that picture of the Georgia doctors on an airplane going to help in New York when COVID was at its peak. And they were able to do that because the licensing laws were lifted. So it's a great example of another way we can get people back to work quickly. We will hear from Michael again in a few minutes. If you have a question,